The Industrial Revolution takes America, and the rest of the world as it started in Great Britain, into the next century, so to speak. Today, we have many technologies at our fingertips. Things that people in the past never even thought possible are now our children's possessions. There are laptops that are specifically designed for small children, cars that plug into a wall and run for hours without sacrificing speed or power, the internet, where information can be found in less than 10 seconds, and millions of other examples. However, in the late 1800s, they weren't thinking of these things. They were looking at expanding into the oil business, building steel factories, and also investing into the industrial ideas of others. They were building the factories that we see every day, creating the products cheaply. They created the ideas of mass production and the assembly line. They pushed each other to constantly improve the products and methods they were using. This is the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution marked a shift in the environment of the United States. Previously, the United States had been reliant on agriculture and growing crops and raising animals for sale and survival. Families worked together to create the textiles that would be sold. This would last no longer once the factories of the industrialized era became commonplace in the cities. It also encouraged a new social change. Originally, society had been based upon privilege. The powerful group got their power because they owned the means of production. If you owned the land or mills, you had the power. This aristocracy had peasants who worked for them, people who were at the bottom of society and reliant on the seasons and the directions of the landowners. They worked his land and they used his mills to make the grain. There were skilled craftsmen who fell between these two, blacksmiths and other craftsmen who provided the tools necessary to sow the fields and work the land. They were a needed bunch. And then the merchants, those people who sold the goods. The Industrial Revolution meant people were now leaving their homes and going to work to a factory, a place filled with new machinery that were very large and could require acres of floor space in order to produce what was necessary to meet the consumer demand. Social structure begins to shift because jobs are becoming highly skilled in an assembly line situation. Skill level began to determine quality of life. However, the skills needed to succeed in this revolutionary time were very different than the skills needed to succeed in an agriculturally based time. Time to work began to shift also. The machines are now driving the workers, and the seasons of the year no longer had any relevancy to the work that needed to be done. Now, adult males were expected to labor 5.5 days a week with 12 to 14 hours on the job all year long. Are the men who created this captains of industry, or are they more likely robber barons? Women are also going to begin finding themselves in an interesting situation. Before, they had been full partners in the family's quest for economic status. Now they were exploited, given the lowest skilled and lowest paying jobs. They were bullied by bosses and husbands alike, and still expected to continue their traditional roles at home, regardless of a day spent in the factory. Haunting photos of children tell us about this exploitation of the future generations. They were always expected to help the family, yet in an agricultural-based world, they were given jobs suitable to the age. Generally, they would even be assigned by their family members. However, the industrial era began to exploit them as well. One of the most dangerous assignments for children in the factories was unjamming the great textile machines that wove cloth. Since their hands and arms were so small, they could reach into small places where the fabric tended to jam. The foreman would not turn the machine off, but would insist the child reach in to dislodge the jam. If he were not quick enough, his hand or arm would be caught in the mechanism, and this could result in severe damage to the child. All laborers began to be looked upon as interchangeable parts, just like the machines they ran. As technology increased and machines became more and more sophisticated, the employer began to value his machinery more than he valued his workforce. In order to protect themselves, the workers formed labor unions, banding together in order to enact change. Later, we will look at events such as the Homestead strikes that will befall a company known as U.S. Steel, which is found in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We will also look at the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, a terrible event that causes the death of hundreds of women, both immigrants and American-born citizens alike. These women find themselves in a situation where they were forced to jump out of a window or be burned to death. These labor unions will seek regulation of hours and pay, more equality between the sexes, and they will also enact child labor laws, encouraging education for children rather than factory employment. So who are these guys that we are determining if they're robber barons, or the bad guy, or if they are just merely a captain of industry, a lucky or a good guy? The first we're going to look at is John D. Rockefeller. He is an oil magnate who grew up in New York and Ohio. He found himself a love of business. By the early 1860s, Rockefeller realized the future of the commission merchant business, in which he was selling the goods of others at a commission price, was limited. He saw the railroads as the next big thing. He saw that the collection and shipment of raw materials was where the money was going to be. He maximized his profits by paying no one outside of his company for any services and finding new uses for what had previously been called waste. In 1859, Edwin Drake will strike oil in Titusville, Pennsylvania, and the oil craze will begin. 1862, Rockefeller will begin to dabble in the oil industry when he sees the high yield of the Pennsylvania high-quality oil. He does not like waste, and he believes success was due to attention to detail. Using this philosophy, he began to look at ways to use the byproducts created in the oil refining business. Rockefeller will hire his own plumbers and buy his own supplies. He built a wood shop to make his own barrels to create the oil. He bought tracts of timber to make these barrels. Everything he needed to refine the oil, he owned. Today, this is known as vertical integration. He owned every step in the process. They found uses for all of the byproducts, selling lubricating oils and creating the early versions of Vaseline, which is also known as petroleum jelly. On January 2, 1882, the Standard Oil Trust was formed. The trust will capitalize quite conservatively at $70 million. The true value is about $200 million. There were 9 trustees who set up all of the Standard properties, and they placed them in the hands of attorney Samuel Dodd. Every stockholder received 20 trust certificates for each share of Standard Oil stock, and the profits of the component companies were set to the 9 trustees who determined the dividends. The 9 trustees elected the directors and officers of all the component companies. Next up is Andrew Carnegie and the eventual company known as U.S. Steel. Andrew Carnegie will found the Carnegie Steel Corporation in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The president of his company, a man named Charles Schwab, came to another potential robber baron, Elbert Gary, who owns the Federal Steel Company in Chicago, Illinois. Through a giant consolidation process, they combined all the major steel companies together into one, and it was known as U.S. Steel. Notice the connection of J. Pierpont Morgan to the U.S. Steel Company. James Pierpont Morgan, a name you probably have heard before. Have you ever heard a commercial for J.P. Morgan Chase, a bank that's still around today? J.P. Morgan, rather than creating his own industry, turned instead to investing in the industrial pursuits of others. He was involved in the railroad lines as well as the steel companies throughout the years. He was a key financer in the consolidation of U.S. Steel. He bought out Carnegie Steel from Andrew Carnegie for a cool $425 million. So, good guys or bad guys? While ruthless, they raised the American standards of industry as they filled their pockets with the money these industries made. Mass production, assembly lines, constantly improving technologies, all of these are what came from the Industrial Revolution. These men also had philanthropic sides. In fact, Andrew Carnegie gave away $350 million of the $425 million in the pursuit of building more libraries. Is it the tough guy pictures in which they all look very stern? Is it the way they build huge conglomerates and reorganize the way we do business? Is it the fact that they taught us there are certain things in life we are no longer willing to live without, like oil? Either way, you decide. Robber barons or just businessmen? So what comes next? Now that we've looked at the Industrial Revolution through the eyes of these robber barons or captains of industry, depending on what you decide, we're now going to look at the labor unions and other strikes. We're going to read about the Homestead Strike, We'll look at immigration patterns and how it begins to rise and it matches what's needed for the Industrial Revolution. And immigrants become a form of very cheap labor. We'll look at settlement patterns and housing and urban development and the way the cities are designed today. Then we'll read about the Sherman Antitrust Act and how all of these trusts were busted up. We'll find ourselves moving into the Spanish-American War and the Progressive Era, where change is in the making.